Last night I was out here for a little bit. I was able to take the lifter trays out, got the cam retainer out and off and the timing chain off, and now I'm getting ready to yank these lifters out and pull this cam out, and then we're going to go ahead and put our BTR Stage 3 positive displacement cam in here and start buttoning this thing back up. Got my heads drug down. They're pretty filthy in here, so I'm gonna need to give those things a good bath. So that probably won't happen tonight, but we'll get the cam in and maybe the lifters in and things of that nature. So I did the other night, I don't know if I recorded any of this, but I did get my old LS7 lifters out and blew all those out and cleaned them up with brake clean. And now they're soaking in the oil, and it looks like a June bug has succumbed to the oil and died, which that's a real tragedy, but you know, it is what it is. So let's get these lifters out. This motor actually was pretty dirty on the inside, a lot of carbon and gunk built up in there. These lifters actually came out pretty difficult. I had to grab a hold of them with a pair of pliers and really yank on them to get them out of the lifter bore. And then the cam also rotated fairly difficult, actually. I was a little worried that maybe we were going to have a bearing issue. Had to grab a hold of the cam with some needle nose pliers and get it coming out, pulling on it that way. Once it started moving out, there wasn't any issues. The bearings look like standard issue LS bearings, look like they're halfway worn through. But once we got the new cam in there, it spun fine. So I think it was just some carbon and some buildup of dirty oil and sludge on the cam. Those are a little rough. We're going to go ahead and rotate the motor over to top dead center. Alright guys, it's time to get the oil pump installed and properly shimmed and aligned. To do that, we're going to go ahead and install the oil pump on the pump drive on the crank and get the oil pump bolts finger tight, so we still have a little bit of play in the oil pump so we can move it around to get it properly shimmed. Once we have the oil pump finger tight, we're going to go ahead and pop the front cover off. This is the oil pump that came out of the LS1 that spun a rod bearing. So I took it all apart and cleaned everything out, made sure there was no metal shavings or engine debris in it, and then went ahead and loaded it up with assembly lube when I put it back together. So that's what the white stuff is in there. Alright, so next we got some feeler gauges. I have a 2.5 thou and a 2 thou feeler gauge, and what we're going to go ahead and do right here is stick it in between the pump drive gear and the housing on the top and on the bottom. It doesn't matter which one you put where, we're just trying to get it centered in the opening. Once we have it centered in the opening and the feeler gauges are put in all the way, we're going to go ahead and tighten down the oil pump bolts, and that should lock the oil pump in, and it should properly shim and align the oil pump. you're going to be reusing your oil pump pickup tube like we are, go ahead and inspect the O-ring, make sure there's no tears or cracks in it. It's probably cheap insurance to replace it, but this one wasn't that old and it looked to be in good shape. So I went ahead and lubed that up and popped it in the oil pump. And then go ahead and tighten down all your baffle nuts. It's always a good idea to write the future you a little note, so I wrote the FTP logo and the date that we assembled it on the baffle. Okay, to get the timing cover, front cover installed correctly, we're going to need to go ahead and install the harmonic balancer pulley. So get the cover sitting on there and get the pulley installed, and that will center the cover where it needs to go. And then you can go ahead and tighten the bolts down, and those get torqued down to 18 foot-pounds. Okay, before you put the oil pan gasket down, you're going to want to put a dab of RTV in each one of the corners where the front and rear cover meet the block. This will help keep oil from seeping out of that crack that the gasket can't get in there and seal. Throw your gasket down, set your oil pan on, and go ahead and get the bolts finger tight. And we're going to want to torque those to 18 foot-pounds for the oil pan to block bolts. The oil pan to front cover gets torqued to 18 foot-pounds, and the oil pan to rear cover get torqued to 106 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. The heads were filthy from sitting on the bench while we were doing the garage construction, so I went ahead and sprayed them down with some degreaser and gave them a good pressure bath and blew them all out with compressed air, dried them off, and then sprayed anything that was metal with WD-40 so that it didn't rust. We went ahead and cleaned all the surface of the block and chased the bolt holes. Each one of those big guys there with a homemade thread chase, because I don't actually own any chases. And you just basically cut a couple grooves in one of the old head bolts and just run that up and down there a couple times. You can kind of see how much, I already scraped it out with my fingernail, but you can see how much crud's in there. And then we went ahead and got our ARP fasteners polished up with the wire wheel, and we're going to go ahead and lube up this end and get those bad boys threaded in there and set a head gasket on there and set a head on this. This is a torque sequence for an LS-based cylinder head. For the big bolts, there will be 3 passes. The first pass, you're going to torque them down to 22 foot-pounds. The second pass will be 90 degrees. The third pass on the long bolts will be 90 degrees, and the third pass on the short bolts will be 50 degrees. For the small M8 bolts, we're going to go ahead and just torque those down 1 pass to 22 foot-pounds. If you're installing ARP head studs like we are, it's a 3-pass procedure. I like to just go through and kind of snug everything up. It's usually about 35 foot-pounds for the first pass. The second pass, I'll go to 55 foot-pounds, and I'll do a third final pass at 75 foot-pounds for the big studs. For the small studs, we'll go ahead and just torque those down to 25 foot-pounds. Remember, all the ARP torque specs are torqued using ARP lube that comes with your hardware. Alright, when tightening down the rocker arms, these are non-adjustable, so we go ahead and torque them down to 22 foot-pounds. You can rotate the motor over so that each rocker is on a base circle, and then tighten it down and torque it to 22 foot-pounds, or what I like to do is just kind of creep up on them because we are going to be compressing some of the valve springs with the impact. Once it gets close, go ahead and finish it off with the torque wrench and torque it down to 22 foot-pounds. All right, Dust, fire it up.